So what I'm going to do is talk about the perspective of the person on the ground, the person who is a recycling manager. As she shared, my background is working on all different levels of actually making the recycling programs work, from having the trucks collect material to engaging students and others with the educational messaging. And from my perspective, I'll just share, this oftentimes is sort of this picture embodies the experience that a lot of us feel at the end of the day. We spend a lot of time investing into the infrastructure. Over the last 50 years, tens of billions of dollars have been put in place into making sure there is bins, there's collection of capacity. And yet, as was shared earlier, the vast majority of recyclables still go in the trash. And so we know there are ways of improving this. And so one of the core points that I want to make is about the gap between the academic side and the practitioner side, and how do we collaborate more together. I'm going to start out just talking a little bit about what our experience is on the ground, and then come back to some of my thoughts on how we can better collaborate. So from a very high level, as I said, a lot of effort's been paid into making sure that we can collect materials, but we've not done a very good job of getting people to engage. And behavior is a huge component of that. Another significant thing that we're facing from a practitioner's experience in recent years has been the issue with contamination. As those of you of my age and older will remember, if you go back to the 90s, oftentimes we collected materials source separated. You have different bins for just cans or for paper, bottles. The emphasis of the educational message that we conveyed was about sort items correctly, and it was a much smaller number of items that you actually could recycle. We shifted over the last 15, 20 years to this model of a single stream in many communities, where we now tell people, put it all in one bin. And the result is that unintended consequence. People have taken that message to heart, and they don't focus on sorting as much because we've de-emphasized that. And the result is that we now have, in some cases, as much as 40% of what's going into a recycling facility may actually be non-recyclable garbage. And that's had big implications on the back end for the industry. Some of you have probably seen media headlines from the last few years about China's no longer accepting our material. Even some examples where stories of material being sent to the landfill after it was collected because it was too contaminated. All this is a significant impact to the recycling managers trying to do our jobs. The economics of our recycling programs have been cut out in many cases. Contaminated material is worth less, so there's less demand for it, and that's revenue that is not there to help to fund programs. So that's a very big issue. And also, it's had, I think, in many ways, it's a counter impact on people's perceptions and their willingness to actually recycle. When we hear stories about material that is put in the recycling bank going to the landfill, whether it's true or not, that creates this urban myth that can perpetuate people's association, and you start to wonder, is it worth the effort? And that can have a real deflating effect. So that's another issue that we're having to address from our side. In many ways, I would argue that recycling industry has been slow to embrace not just the science of behavior change, but the complexity of it and just how complex it is. Recall, I mean, this is an industry that grew out of trash collection, and there's nothing more basic than simply sitting out a bin and having a truck go by to empty it. But once we shift into asking people to do something more complex, doing that sorting, it's much more involved, and we've been slow as an industry to embrace that, I would argue. Another issue in a lot of cases for practitioners is that there are a lot of different stakeholders involved. There are a lot of different people who are involved in making recycling happen, from the recycling manager on a municipal level to the brands that Scott was talking about, who have a distinct role. That you have private companies who are the manufacturers who are taking this material and collecting it. You have policyholders. You also, on a very basic level, you have people involved, facility managers, others who influence programs. It might be the architect who decides, excuse me, which bin is going to be set out, but they're not directly involved with recycling, despite the fact that they have a lot of impact on how programs are designed. And And so I mentioned this because this sort of balkanized way that recycling industry has been set up, especially in the United States, creates a lot of areas that I think have been hobbled our success as an industry, and it made it increased confusion that has depressed recycling's impact in a lot of ways. That's starting to change in a lot recently, but just to cite a couple examples of how I see the dynamic playing out. The bins that you see in the upper right-hand corner are from Herald Square in New York City. These bins were designed by an architect. They were put in place there. They won an award for being very aesthetically looking nice. But a core question is, which one of these bins is for trash? From a recycling manager's perspective, if you look inside these bins, in most cases, people are going to get confused because it's not clear which one is which. These bins can fill up with a lot of trash. And then on the lower hand example, I'll just point out that one community may talk about what's recyclable, and it could be a completely different list from what's recyclable in a different community. And that disconnect, that lack of uniformity, is also a big factor. So so there's a need for academics and practitioners to collaborate more. On one level, I think part of it is simply taking the information that all of you are gathering, what you're finding in your research, and translating that from the more abstract principles, understandings of behavioral psychology. How do you translate that into an actual best practice that a recycling manager can put into use? Keep in mind that on the recycling industry side, there's not, folks are busy making trucks run, they're making programs operate, they're not necessarily stopping to read academic papers. So there's a gap there and the need to help translate some of that information into recycling manager speak, as it were. Organizations like the Recycling Partnership, Keep America Beautiful, are both doing a good job starting to fill that role. But nonetheless, there's a disconnect. Another observation I would make is that a lot of the times the research that is done may not even have a direct connection to a practical takeaway that can work for a recycling manager. Just to point out a couple examples, a lot of studies have shown that a particular message or a particular practice can have an impact, but you're doing a very narrow measurement of a defined time period. What about a year from now? Is that practice something that will continue to have an impact? Is it worth retooling your program, retooling your education, because you know it's going to have a long-term impact or not? That's one question oftentimes that can be lacking. Another one is understanding that with messaging, one of the biggest factors in my experience is just the attention span. We can refine a really effective message for somebody sitting in the lab where you can have their undivided attention. But when you're trying to communicate to somebody who is walking up to a recycling bin and they've given it 0.05% of a second of their attention, that message may not reach that person. So figuring out more how to close that gap and how we actually connect, the theory in the lab to the practice on the ground. There are a number of ways that I can suggest that we can be better collaborating on the two sides. One is, from the practitioner's perspective, a lot of the programs that we're operating are based on anecdotal experience. We've talked to colleagues, they said this worked, they think, but for the most part, we're making operations run and we don't have the bandwidth or the resources necessarily to actually document that. And that becomes a problem because we know there are successful programs, but when it's time to take that idea and I want to adapt it at my facility, I need to be able to prove that it actually has impact before I can get folks, my administrators, to buy off and support that investment. If we're able to work with the folks who are implementing programs to show what actually works, that makes it much easier for me to point to that science and say, this worked. As just one example, you see here, this photograph is from some recycling bins at the University of Georgia. My company, Busch Systems, did a project with their UGA's sustainability office last year, where we took bins that had no signs above them at all. They were just the traditional sign with a small little label on it. A lot of people have been adding signs above the bins on the theory that something more eye level will catch their attention, it will have more impact. But there really was no scientific research to prove that. So we worked with UGA to do waste audits before and after these were implemented. We tried a number of different messages, including one tied to product salience, and we were able to show when you blend all the different messaging, we had an average of 18% improvement in recycling by adding this. That information right there, even though a lot of it's intuitive, simply having that information documented was able to help the UGA's Office of Sustainability get buy-in to invest in transforming the entire network of bins across the entire campus. And that kind of information, once we can communicate that out to a broader audience, to other universities, other facilities, can help them point to, here's something concrete, this is worth making the effort. I would also suggest that the opportunity is there on the opposite side, where practitioners can help academics with when you're designing studies. Again, one of the points that I made earlier is that the studies may reveal a lot about some of the abstract behavioral dynamics that are happening, but they don't necessarily translate into specific takeaways that a recycling manager can take and implement. So I think there's a real opportunity to involve people, involve those managers on the front end when you're designing the study. You communicate, these are the theories that I'm looking at, and these are the possible outcomes that may come from this, and asking them to say, well, in practice, this would be helpful, this won't be helpful. That's all information that can help you so that you're guiding your studies from the beginning to both answer the academic questions that you have, but also make sure that they're going to translate into actionable, impactful practices on their end. So I know we're probably going to spend some time during our Q&A talking about some of the knowledge gaps, but I want to just point out a couple, I won't go through all these, but just high level, a couple observations. I made reference to there's a lot of complex information about what and how to recycle, what kinds of plastics, what shape, what types of resins. There's a huge amount of complexity that we're trying to distill and communicate in the simplest possible way to the average person. And there's still a lot of need to really understand what the best way is to synthesize that and communicate that. Another area that I would point to would be another area I would point to is how do we leverage branding more? We know, obviously, from a marketing perspective, when you have a strong brand, people are more likely to identify with that. Again, this is something I think has been slow within the recycling industry to adapt. Things like uniform colors between bins in different locations, consistent messaging, all those are things that reinforce a brand. And I think a lot of us know that intuitively, but having hard science that we can point to helps the recycling industry holistically to coalesce around this is a priority. If we want to advance, we really need to make more of an effort around this. And so I think we could use our help as an industry absorbing that collective message, and where there's an opportunity to document that in a recycling context would be of great value. And then a couple of things I would point out here. Culture is a big one. One of the programs that I used to manage when I was with Keep America Beautiful was called Recycle Media. And this is where we worked with colleges and universities using a competition as a framework for doing messaging out to students. We know that social component, competition is one of the techniques that can motivate people. One of the things I used to hear a lot, though, was from a campus that did not have a strong culture, that did not have a strong recycling expectation already. So if you want to use that social component to engage people, the question to them was, well, what if the social component, social dynamic is the opposite? We don't recycle. That is the culture. So how do you change a culture? Developing more tools and understanding of how a recycling educator can engage their audience around this is a strong area, I think, where we could use more collaboration. Another area would be, again, how do we synthesize the number of studies that have been done and turn those into practical knowledge that could be translated out to recycling managers. I spent a lot of time looking at just studies specific to signage, what goes on top of bins. How do you come up with the right wording. All those are areas that I think there's a strong need for going forward.